Serbian Dancing Lady, The Horror Night Stories, The Whispering Winds of Belgrade. Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, is a city rich in history, culture, and legends. But amidst the vibrant streets and the echoes of ancient battles, there lies a tale that sends shivers down the spines of those who dare to speak of it. A tale that begins on a cold, moonless night in a desolate neighborhood. The winds that usually brought the comforting scent of fresh bread and coffee from the local bakeries carried something more sinister that evening, a whisper, a warning, a chilling premonition of what was to come. As the clock struck midnight, the streets fell silent, save for the eerie creaking of old wooden signs swaying in the wind. The usual hum of life in the city had given way to an unsettling stillness, a void that seemed to pull at the soul of anyone brave enough to step outside. It was as if the city itself knew that something was amiss. The first sightings. It began as a rumor, shared in hushed tones over cups of steaming rakija in dimly lit taverns. A woman, dressed in traditional Serbian attire, had been seen dancing alone in the dark alleys of Belgrade. Her movements were graceful, almost hypnotic, yet there was something profoundly unnatural about them, an otherworldly fluidity that defied the laws of physics. Those who claimed to have seen her described her as both beautiful and terrifying, her face obscured by a veil, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The first sightings were dismissed as drunken hallucinations or the ramblings of old men trying to scare the younger generation. But as the nights grew colder and the sightings more frequent, the whispers turned to fear. People began locking their doors and windows as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the once bustling streets became a ghost town after dark. The unfortunate encounter. One fateful night, a group of teenagers decided to test the legend. They were young, full of bravado, and eager to prove that the Serbian Dancing Lady was nothing more than a myth. Armed with flashlights and smartphones, they ventured into the heart of the deserted neighborhood where she had been most frequently seen. At first it was just a game, nervous laughter and playful taunts echoing off the cold stone walls. But as they delved deeper into the labyrinth of alleys, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural fog began to curl around their feet, obscuring the ground and swallowing the light from their flashlights. The laughter faded, replaced by a growing sense of unease. And then they saw her. At the end of the alley, bathed in the sickly glow of a flickering street lamp, she danced. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and entrancing, drawing them closer despite the rising terror in their hearts. They tried to speak, to call out to her, but no sound escaped their lips. It was as if the very air had turned to ice, freezing their voices in their throats. One of the boys, the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, stepped forward. His hand trembled as he reached out, the fog parting slightly to reveal the ground beneath his feet. But before he could get any closer, the woman stopped dancing. She turned slowly, her veil lifting just enough to reveal the hollow void where her eyes should have been. In that instant, the boy knew that the stories were true. The Serbian Dancing Lady was no mere ghost. She was a harbinger of death, a soul trapped between worlds, forever cursed to dance in the shadows of Belgrade. He tried to run, but his legs refused to obey. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was her outstretched hand, beckoning him to join her eternal dance. The aftermath. The next morning, the boy's body was found in the alley, his face twisted in an expression of sheer terror. There were no signs of a struggle, no wounds or marks on his body, just the unmistakable look of someone who had seen something beyond the realm of human comprehension. His friends were found wandering the streets in a daze, their minds shattered, unable to recall anything from the night before. Word of the incident spread like wildfire, and the legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady took on a new life. No longer was she a mere curiosity or a subject of idle gossip. She was a threat, a malevolent force that could strike at any time. The neighborhood where she had been seen became a place of fear, avoided by all but the most foolhardy. The curse of the Dancing Lady. In the weeks that followed, more bodies were found, each one more horrifying than the last. Some were contorted into unnatural positions, as if they had been forced to dance until their bodies broke. Others bore expressions of such profound despair that it seemed as though they had glimpsed the very depths of hell. The common thread among them all was the eerie, echoing sound of music that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It became clear that the Serbian Dancing Lady was not just a ghost, she was a curse, a manifestation of some ancient evil that had been unleashed upon the city. Theories abounded, ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Some claimed that she was the spirit of a woman who had been wronged in life, doomed to dance for eternity until her soul found peace. Others believed that she was a demon, summoned by dark rituals long forgotten, feeding on the fear and misery of her victims. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the Serbian Dancing Lady was real, and she was not bound by the physical world. She could appear anywhere, at any time, and once she set her sights on you, there was no escape. The night of reckoning. As the body count rose, the city of Belgrade was gripped by a sense of impending doom. The authorities were at a loss, unable to explain the deaths or the strange phenomena surrounding them. Priests were called in to perform exorcisms, but their prayers seemed to have no effect. The only thing that could be done was to wait and hope that the curse would eventually pass. But one man refused to sit idly by. A local historian, well versed in the occult, believed that the only way to stop the Serbian Dancing Lady was to confront her directly. He spent weeks researching the legend, delving into ancient texts and forgotten lore, piecing together the clues that would lead him to the heart of the curse. On the night of the full moon, he ventured into the neighborhood where the dancing lady had first been seen, armed with nothing but his wits and a small vial of holy water. The streets were deserted, the air thick with tension, as he made his way to the alley where it had all begun. There she was, dancing in the moonlight, her movements as fluid and mesmerizing as ever. But this time, the historian was prepared. He stepped forward, chanting an ancient incantation under his breath, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The dancing lady paused, her head tilting slightly as if to listen. For a moment, it seemed as though the curse might be broken. The fog lifted, and the air grew lighter. But then, without warning, she lunged at him, her veil falling away to reveal a face twisted in rage and sorrow. The historian barely had time to react, throwing the vial of holy water at her just as she reached him. There was a blinding flash of light, and the alley was filled with the sound of 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The dancing lady recoiled, her form flickering and distorting as the holy water took effect. For a brief moment, the historian saw her as she truly was, a tormented soul, trapped in a cycle of eternal agony, desperately seeking release. And then she was gone. The legacy of the Serbian Dancing Lady. In the days that followed, the strange deaths ceased, and the fog that had plagued the city lifted. Belgrade returned to its normal rhythms, the memory of the Serbian Dancing Lady fading into the annals of urban legend. But those who had witnessed her knew that the curse had not been lifted, merely postponed. The historian's confrontation had only driven her back into the shadows, where she would wait, biding her time until the next unlucky soul crossed her path. To this day, the story of the Serbian Dancing Lady is told in hushed tones, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of the light. And if you ever find yourself in the deserted streets of Belgrade on a cold, moonless night, you might just hear the faint sound of music on the wind, the haunting melody of the Serbian Dancing Lady calling out for her next dance partner. A curse unearthed. In the heart of Serbia, a land steeped in tradition and mysticism, stories of the supernatural have always held a special place in the collective consciousness. Yet few tales are as chilling or as deeply ingrained in the local folklore as that of the Serbian Dancing Lady. For generations, whispers of her ghostly figure have passed through the small, cobblestone villages and bustling cities, but it wasn't until the turn of the century that her legend would truly take hold, unleashing a wave of terror that would leave the country reeling. The origins of the Serbian Dancing Lady are shrouded in mystery, with each version of the tale more terrifying than the last. Some say she was once a noblewoman, cursed for her vanity, condemned to dance for eternity as punishment for her sins. Others claim she was a peasant who made a pact with the devil, trading her soul for the ability to dance so beautifully that no mortal man could resist her. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: those who encounter her are never the same again. The night of the first dance. It was a warm summer evening in 1902 when the first documented sighting of the Serbian Dancing Lady occurred. The small village of Mladenovac was preparing for its annual festival, a celebration of the harvest that brought together families from miles around. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and music, the smell of roasted lamb and fresh bread wafting through the streets. But as the night wore on, a strange and unsettling feeling began to creep over the village. Just before midnight, as the last of the revelers were making their way home, a lone figure appeared in the town square. She was dressed in a flowing white gown, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders, and her feet moving in an intricate hypnotic dance. At first, the villagers were entranced by her beauty, their fatigue melting away as they watched her glide across the cobblestones with an ethereal grace. But as they drew closer, something changed. The music in the air grew discordant, the once cheerful melodies turning into a sinister, haunting tune. The woman's movements became more frantic, her dance more desperate, as if she were trying to escape some unseen force. The villagers, now fully under her spell, could only watch in horror as her eyes, once bright and full of life, turned black, her face contorted into a mask of agony. Before anyone could react, the woman let out a blood-curdling scream, her body convulsing violently as she collapsed to the ground. The villagers rushed to her side, but it was too late. She was dead, her lifeless body twisted in an unnatural position, her eyes staring blankly into the night sky. News of the incident spread quickly, and soon the entire country was talking about the Serbian Dancing Lady. Some claimed she was a ghost, others a demon, but all agreed on one thing: her appearance was a harbinger of death. Those who had witnessed her dance began to fall ill, their health deteriorating rapidly as they were consumed by visions of the woman, her haunting face appearing in their dreams, her voice echoing in their minds. The rising fear. Over the years, the legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady grew, each new sighting more terrifying than the last. She was seen in abandoned buildings, forgotten cemeteries, and desolate streets, always dancing, always alone. Those who were unlucky enough to encounter her would find themselves drawn into her world, their bodies moving of their own accord, compelled to join her in her eternal dance. The pattern was always the same: a figure dressed in white, dancing in the moonlight, her movements both graceful and horrifying. She would appear out of nowhere, luring her victims into her deadly embrace with a dance so mesmerizing that they could not look away. And when the dance ended, so too would their lives. No one knew where she came from or why she danced, but everyone knew to fear her. Children were warned not to stay out after dark, and adults avoided the streets at night, lest they too fall victim to her curse. The Serbian Dancing Lady had become a symbol of death, a reminder that no matter how safe one might feel, there was always something lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. The Haunted Village. One of the most chilling accounts of the Serbian Dancing Lady comes from the village of Aranđelovac, where an entire community was brought to its knees by her malevolent presence. The village had always been a quiet, peaceful place, its residents living simple lives, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But all that changed one fateful night in the winter of 1927. It started with a strange noise, a faint rhythmic tapping that echoed through the village streets. At first, it was barely noticeable, easily dismissed as the creaking of old wood or the rustling of leaves. But as the night wore on, the noise grew louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. The villagers, now wide awake and filled with a growing sense of dread, gathered in the town square, desperate to find the source of the sound. And there, in the center of the square, they saw her. The Serbian Dancing Lady, her white gown billowing in the cold winter wind, was dancing. Her feet moved in a rapid, staccato rhythm, the sound of her steps echoing off the stone walls of the surrounding buildings. Her face was obscured by a veil, but her eyes, those dark, soulless eyes, shone through, locking onto the villagers with an intensity that sent chills down their spines. The villagers watched in horror as one by one, their friends and neighbors fell to the ground, their bodies twitching and jerking as if caught in the grip of some unseen force. The lady's dance grew faster, more frantic, as she drew closer to her victims, her movements growing more erratic with each passing second. And then, with a final bone-chilling scream, she was gone. In the days that followed, the village was gripped by fear. The bodies of those who had fallen that night were found twisted and broken, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. The survivors spoke of a curse, of a dark force that had been unleashed upon them by the Serbian Dancing Lady. The village was abandoned soon after, its residents fleeing in terror, leaving behind only empty houses and a lingering sense of dread. The modern-day encounters. While the legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady is rooted in history, her presence is not confined to the past. In recent years, there have been numerous reports of sightings across Serbia, each one more terrifying than the last. From the bustling streets of Belgrade to the remote countryside, the Serbian Dancing Lady has become a symbol of fear, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. In 2017, a young couple was driving through the mountains near the town of TERIBBLE when they encountered her. The road was empty, the night dark and silent, when suddenly the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. She was dressed in white, her face hidden by a veil, and she was dancing. The couple, terrified, tried to drive past her, but their car stalled, the engine dying as if in response to her presence. The woman approached the car, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes locking onto theirs through the windshield. They tried to scream to move, but they were paralyzed, frozen in place by her gaze. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The car started up again, and they sped away, never looking back. In 2020, a group of hikers reported a similar encounter in the Tara National Park. They had been exploring a remote trail when they heard the faint sound of music coming from the trees. Curious, they'd followed the sound, only to find themselves in a small clearing where the Serbian Dancing Lady was waiting for them. She danced in the moonlight, her feet moving silently across the forest floor, her eyes fixed on the group. The hikers, overcome with fear, fled the scene, but one of them, a young man in his 20s, was not so lucky. He was found the next morning, his body contorted in an unnatural position, his face twisted in an expression of pure terror. The official cause of death was ruled as a heart attack, but those who knew the legend knew better. The Serbian Dancing Lady had claimed another victim. The final dance. As the legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady continues to grow, so too does the fear that surrounds her. Her story has become a part of Serbian culture, a reminder of the dark forces that lurk just beyond the edge of the light. But for those who have encountered her, the legend is all too real. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the air is thick with the scent of jasmine, you can still hear her dance. The soft, rhythmic tapping of her feet, the faint strains of music carried on the wind, the eerie feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. And if you're brave or foolish enough to follow the sound, you might just catch a glimpse of her, dancing in the shadows, her eyes locking onto yours, drawing you into her world. But be warned, those who dance with the Serbian Dancing Lady never return. Once she has chosen you, there is no escape. Her dance is eternal, her curse unbreakable, and her hunger for souls insatiable. So if you ever find yourself alone on a dark, moonlit night and you hear the faint sound of music on the wind, remember this: turn back, run, and never look back. For if you don't, you may just find yourself joining the Serbian Dancing Lady in her eternal dance of death. The legend reborn. As time passed, the legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady became intertwined with the very fabric of Serbian culture. It was a story told to children to keep them from wandering the streets at night, a ghostly tale whispered among friends at sleepovers, and a source of inspiration for countless works of art, literature, and film. Yet, despite the countless retellings, one thing remained constant: the palpable fear that accompanied the mention of her name. But the legend was far from being just a story. For those who lived near the sites of her supposed appearances, the fear was real, and the consequences of encountering her were deadly. Some say that she is drawn to places of great sorrow, where the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. Others believe that her presence is a warning of impending doom, a harbinger of death and disaster. And as the 21st century unfolded, the Serbian Dancing Lady would make her presence known once more, this time with even greater ferocity. The Dark Festival of Kalemegdan. Kalemegdan, Belgrade's ancient fortress, is a place steeped in history, its walls having witnessed countless battles and bloodshed over the centuries. But in 2013, it became the site of a far more sinister event, a music festival that would end in tragedy, leaving those who attended haunted by the memory of what they had seen. It was meant to be a celebration, a night of music, dancing, and revelry under the stars. Thousands of people gathered in the shadow of the fortress, their spirits high as they danced to the pulsating beats of the DJ. But as midnight approached, a strange sensation began to ripple through the crowd, a feeling of unease, as if they were being watched by something unseen. The music suddenly cut out, plunging the festival into an eerie silence. The lights flickered and then dimmed, casting long shadows across the ancient stone walls. And then, from the darkness, she appeared. At first, she seemed like any other festival goer, a woman in a white dress, swaying to the rhythm of a music that only she could hear. But as she moved through the crowd, her dance growing more intense, the air around her seemed to grow colder, the very ground beneath her feet trembling with each step. Her face was obscured by a veil, but her eyes, those dark, soulless eyes, pierced through the darkness, locking onto anyone who dared to look at her. Panic spread like wildfire as people began to realize that this was no ordinary dancer. The crowd surged towards the exits, desperate to escape, but it was as if an invisible force was holding them in place, drawing them closer to the woman as she danced. Her movements were hypnotic, her body twisting and contorting in ways that defied human anatomy. And as she danced, a low, haunting melody filled the air, a tune that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The horror reached its climax when the woman suddenly stopped dancing. She turned slowly to face the stage, her gaze fixed on the DJ, who stood frozen in place, unable to move. With a single fluid motion, she raised her arms, and the melody grew louder, more intense, as if it were coming from within her. The DJ collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing violently before going still, his face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. The woman continued to dance, her movements growing more frantic, her body blurring as she spun faster and faster. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The lights flickered back to life, the music resumed, and the crowd, now in a state of shock, dispersed into the night. In the days that followed, the festival became the subject of intense scrutiny. The media speculated about what had happened, with some suggesting that it was a publicity stunt gone wrong, while others believed that it was a mass hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But those who had been there knew the truth. The Serbian Dancing Lady had returned, and she had claimed yet another victim. The DJ's death was ruled as a sudden cardiac arrest, but those who had seen the look on his face knew better. His body was found twisted in an unnatural position, his hands clenched into fists as if he had been trying to fight off something or someone before he died. The festival organizers were never able to explain the strange occurrences that night, and Kalemegdan was left with a permanent stain on its history. The shadow of Avala Mountain. Avala Mountain, located just outside Belgrade, is a place of natural beauty, its slopes covered in dense forests and dotted with ancient ruins. It is a popular destination for hikers and nature lovers drawn to its serene landscapes and panoramic views. But in 2016, Avala became the site of a chilling encounter with the Serbian Dancing Lady, one that would leave the local community in a state of fear. It was late autumn, the trees shedding their leaves as the first hints of winter began to creep into the air. A group of friends, eager to enjoy one last hike before the snow set in, decided to explore a lesser-known trail that wound its way up the mountain. The trail was narrow and steep, the trees thick and imposing, but the group was undeterred, their laughter and chatter echoing through the forest. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder, the once vibrant colors of the forest fading into shades of gray. The wind picked up, howling through the trees with an almost human-like wail, and the group began to feel as if they were being watched. They dismissed it as nerves, pressing on despite the growing sense of unease. But as they reached a clearing near the summit, they stopped in their tracks. There, standing in the center of the clearing, was a woman in a white dress, her back turned to them as she swayed to an unseen rhythm. The wind seemed to die down as they approached, the air thick with tension as they realized who she was. The Serbian Dancing Lady. The friends froze, their hearts pounding in their chests as they watched her dance. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her arms rising and falling in a fluid motion, her feet barely touching the ground. The clearing seemed to darken around her, the trees casting long, twisted shadows that reached out like claws, as if trying to drag her back into the earth. One of the friends, unable to take his eyes off her, stepped forward, his hand outstretched as if to touch her. But before he could get any closer, she stopped dancing. She turned to face him, her veil lifting just enough to reveal the hollow void where her eyes should have been. In that moment, the friend knew he was doomed. The woman let out a piercing scream, a sound that echoed through the forest like 1,000 souls crying out in agony. The ground beneath their feet shook, and the trees seemed to bend towards them, their branches reaching out like fingers. The friends tried to run, but the forest had come alive, the once narrow trail now a maze of twisted roots and thorny vines. They stumbled and fell, their clothes torn and bloody as they fought to escape. But the woman was always there, just behind them, her dance growing faster and more erratic with each step they took. The air around them grew colder, the very life draining from their bodies as they struggled to breathe. And then, just as they thought they could run no more, the woman vanished. The forest grew still, the wind dying down to a gentle breeze. The friends, exhausted and terrified, stumbled down the mountain, never looking back. When they finally reached the safety of their cars, they realized that one of their group was missing. The friend who had tried to touch the Serbian dancing lady. His body was never found, and his name was added to the growing list of those who had fallen victim to her curse. The ghostly warning. In the years that followed, the legend of the Serbian dancing lady continued to spread, her presence felt in every corner of Serbia. From the bustling streets of Belgrade to the remote villages of the countryside, her story became a warning, a reminder that some forces are beyond human understanding, and that the past can never truly be forgotten. In 2019, a group of paranormal investigators decided to document the legend, hoping to capture evidence of the Serbian dancing lady on film. Armed with cameras, audio recorders, and other equipment, they set out to explore the places where she had been most frequently seen, determined to uncover the truth behind the legend. Their journey took them to some of the darkest and most haunted locations in Serbia, from the abandoned houses of Aranjelovac to the ancient ruins of Kalemegdan. But it was in a small, forgotten village in the heart of the country that they would encounter something truly terrifying. The village, long abandoned and overgrown with weeds, had an eerie, unsettling atmosphere. The investigators, undeterred by the warnings of the locals, set up their equipment in the crumbling remains of an old church, hoping to capture some evidence of the supernatural. As night fell, the temperature dropped and a thick fog rolled in, obscuring the village from view. The investigators huddled together in the church, their nerves on edge as they waited for something, anything, to happen. And then, just after midnight, they heard it. The soft, rhythmic sound of footsteps coming from the darkness outside. The investigators froze, their eyes wide with fear as they listened to the sound growing louder, closer, until it was right outside the church door. The air grew thick with the scent of jasmine, and a strange, low melody began to play, as if carried on the wind. The door creaked open, and there she was, the Serbian dancing lady. She moved slowly into the church, her feet barely touching the ground as she danced to the haunting melody. The investigators, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as she glided towards them, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The cameras whirred and clicked, but the footage they captured would later be found corrupted, the images distorted beyond recognition. One of the investigators, a young woman named Anna, found herself drawn to the dancer, her body moving of its own accord as she stepped forward. The others tried to hold her back, but it was as if an invisible force was pulling her towards the woman, her feet moving in time with the dancers. As Anna reached out to touch the woman, the others screamed for her to stop, but it was too late. The Serbian dancing lady's hand shot out, grabbing Anna by the wrist, her grip cold as ice. The investigators watched in horror as Anna's face contorted in pain, her body writhing as if caught in an unseen vice. And then, with a final, piercing scream, Anna collapsed to the ground. The Serbian dancing lady vanished into the fog, leaving behind only the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. Anna survived, but she was never the same. Her once vibrant personality was replaced by a deep, unshakable fear, and she refused to speak of what had happened that night. The footage they had captured was unusable, the images corrupted, and the audio filled with strange, otherworldly sounds. The investigation was abandoned, and the village was left to decay, forgotten by all but those who knew the true horror of the Serbian dancing lady. The Eternal Dance. The legend of the Serbian dancing lady continues to haunt Serbia to this day. Her story is one of tragedy, of a soul trapped between worlds, forever cursed to dance in the shadows of a land that has seen too much death and suffering. But it is also a story of warning, a reminder that some forces are beyond our control, and that the darkness is always closer than we think. To this day, people still report sightings of the Serbian dancing lady, her figure glimpsed in the moonlit streets of Belgrade, or her eerie dance seen in the mist-covered forests of the countryside. Some say that she is a guardian, protecting Serbia from an even greater evil, while others believe that she is a vengeful spirit, forever seeking to claim more souls to join her in her eternal dance. But one thing is certain, those who encounter her are never the same. Her presence is a curse, her dance a death sentence, and her story a chilling reminder that the past is never truly gone. So if you ever find yourself alone on a dark, moonless night and you hear the faint sound of music on the wind, take heed, turn back, and never look back. For if you do, you may find yourself dancing with the Serbian Dancing Lady trapped in her eternal nightmare. The origin of the curse. The tale of the Serbian Dancing Lady is ancient, far older than any written records. It is said that the curse began centuries ago in a small, remote village hidden deep within the Serbian mountains. The village, known as Zmajevo, was isolated from the outside world, its inhabitants living a simple life, untouched by the troubles of the greater world. But beneath the peaceful surface of Zmajevo, a dark secret festered, one that would give birth to the legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady. The story begins with a woman named Vasilisa. Vasilisa was the most beautiful woman in the village, her beauty unmatched and her grace unparalleled. She was also a talented dancer, her movements so fluid and captivating that it was said she could charm the very birds from the trees. But Vasilisa's beauty was both a blessing and a curse. The men of the village were enchanted by her, while the women grew jealous and resentful. One winter, a stranger arrived in Zmajevo. He was a wealthy nobleman from a distant land, traveling through the mountains on his way to the coast. When he saw Vasilisa, he was immediately struck by her beauty and grace. He offered her riches beyond her wildest dreams, asking her to leave the village and become his wife. But Vasilisa, loyal to her family and her village, refused his offer. The nobleman, angered by her rejection, cursed Vasilisa in a fit of rage. He declared that she would never find peace, that she would dance for eternity, her beauty turning to horror as she wandered the earth in search of a soul to take her place. The villagers, fearful of the nobleman's wrath, turned against Vasilisa, blaming her for the curse that had befallen their home. They drove her out into the cold, snowy night, her pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. Alone and heartbroken, Vasilisa wandered into the mountains, her tears freezing on her cheeks as the snow began to fall. She danced through the night, her movements slow and mournful, until the cold finally took her, her body frozen in the snow. But Vasilisa's spirit did not rest. The curse laid upon her by the nobleman bound her to the earth, her soul trapped in an endless cycle of torment. She became the Serbian Dancing Lady, her once beautiful face twisted into a mask of sorrow and rage. Her dance, once a symbol of grace and beauty, became a harbinger of death, her presence a warning of the dark forces that lurked in the shadows. The haunting of the monastery. In the centuries that followed, the legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady spread across Serbia, her story taking on new forms and meanings as it passed from village to village. But one of the most chilling tales comes from a small monastery high in the Serbian mountains, where the monks still speak in hushed tones of the night the Serbian Dancing Lady came to visit. The monastery, known as Manastir Sveta Gora, was a place of solitude and prayer, its walls sheltering those who sought to live a life of peace and contemplation. But one winter, the monks began to experience strange occurrences. It started with the sound of music, soft, distant, and haunting, carried on the wind that swept through the monastery's courtyards. The monks, puzzled but not alarmed, continued with their daily prayers, dismissing the sounds as a trick of the wind. But as the nights grew colder, the music grew louder, closer, until it seemed to echo through the very walls of the monastery. The monks would wake in the middle of the night, their hearts pounding, as they heard the faint, rhythmic sound of footsteps outside their doors. And then, one night, they saw her. The Serbian Dancing Lady appeared in the courtyard, her white dress glowing in the moonlight, her feet moving in time with the music that now filled the monastery. The monks watched in terror as she danced, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, locked onto theirs. The abbot, a wise and devout man, recognized the danger at once. He gathered the monks in the chapel, leading them in prayer as they tried to banish the spirit from their holy ground. But the Serbian Dancing Lady was no ordinary ghost. She was a cursed soul, bound to the earth by forces far older and darker than anything the monks had ever encountered. As the monks prayed, the lady's dance grew faster, more erratic, her body blurring as she moved through the courtyard. The music grew louder, more intense, drowning out the monks' voices as they struggled to maintain their prayers. The very walls of the monastery seemed to tremble, the ancient stone cracking under the strain of the lady's presence. And then, with a final desperate scream, the abbot threw open the doors of the chapel, stepping out into the courtyard. He held aloft a relic, a piece of the true cross, its ancient wood glowing with a soft, golden light. The Serbian dancing lady paused, her body shuddering as she turned to face the abbot. For a moment, the two stood locked in a silent battle of wills, the air between them thick with tension. And then, with a sudden violent motion, the lady lunged at the abbot, her hands outstretched, her face twisted in rage. But before she could reach him, the light of the relic flared, filling the courtyard with a blinding holy light. The lady screamed, her voice a chorus of agony, as her body was engulfed in the light, her form flickering and distorting until, with a final piercing cry, she vanished into the night. The monks, shaken but unharmed, fell to their knees in prayer, thanking God for their deliverance. The abbot, exhausted but triumphant, returned the relic to its place in the chapel, his hands trembling as he locked it away. The Serbian dancing lady had been banished, but the monks knew that the curse was not broken, merely held at bay by the power of their faith. To this day, the monks of Manastir Sveta Gora keep vigil on the coldest nights, when the wind howls through the mountains and the sound of distant music can be heard on the air. They know that the Serbian dancing lady is still out there, wandering the earth, searching for a soul to take her place. And they know that one day she will return. The ritual of the Black Forest. Deep in the heart of Serbia lies a place known only to the most knowledgeable and daring. A dark, ancient forest where few dare to venture. The locals call it Karnasuma, the Black Forest, and they speak of it with a mixture of fear and reverence. It is said that the forest is a place of great power, where the boundaries between the living and the dead are thin, and where the Serbian dancing lady was born. The Black Forest is a place of shadows, its dense canopy blocking out the sun even on the brightest days. The trees, twisted and gnarled, seem to move of their own accord, their branches reaching out like claws to ensnare those who wander too close. The ground is covered in a thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves, and the air is heavy with the scent of decay. It was in this forest, many centuries ago, that a group of villagers from Zmajevo sought to break the curse that had plagued their home. They had heard of a powerful sorceress who lived deep within the Black Forest, a woman said to have knowledge of the ancient arts and the power to undo even the most terrible curses. Desperate and afraid, the villagers made the long and perilous journey into the heart of the forest, their hearts filled with hope and dread. They carried with them offerings of gold and jewels, hoping to appease the sorceress and win her favor. When they finally reached her dwelling, a small, dilapidated hut hidden among the trees, they were greeted by an old woman, her eyes milky white and her skin as wrinkled as parchment. The sorceress listened to their pleas, her face expressionless, as they begged her to free them from the curse of the Serbian dancing lady. For a moment, the sorceress said nothing, her gaze distant as she considered their request. Then, with a slow nod, she agreed to help them, but her price was steep. She demanded the life of a pure, untainted soul, one who had never known sin or sorrow. The villagers, horrified, hesitated, but their fear of the curse outweighed their moral qualms. They returned to Zmajevo and after much searching found a young girl, barely more than a child, who fit the sorceress's requirements. With heavy hearts, they took her back to the Black Forest, offering her up as the sacrifice that would break the curse. The sorceress performed the ritual deep within the forest, chanting in a language long forgotten as the villagers watched in terror. The air grew thick with magic, the trees bending and swaying as if in response to the ancient words. The girl, her face pale and tear-streaked, stood silently, her eyes wide with fear. As the ritual reached its climax, the sorceress raised her hands to the sky, calling upon the spirits of the forest to take the girl and lift the curse from Zmajevo. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. The spirits, angered by the sacrifice of an innocent, turned on the villagers, their wrath unleashed in a torrent of dark energy. The villagers were struck down where they stood, their bodies twisted and broken, their souls consumed by the vengeful spirits. The sorceress, too, was caught in the blast, her body disintegrating into ash as the forest itself seemed to come alive, the trees closing in around the clearing. And the girl? She was transformed, her body turned to mist, her soul bound to the earth, forever cursed to dance in the shadows of the Black Forest. She became the Serbian Dancing Lady, her spirit infused with the anger and sorrow of the spirits who had been wronged. The Black Forest has been a place of fear ever since, its dark depths untouched by human hands. Those who venture too close speak of strange sounds and eerie lights, of the faint sound of music carried on the wind. And some say that on the darkest nights, when the moon is hidden and the stars are dim, you can still see her, the Serbian Dancing Lady, dancing among the trees, her eyes filled with sorrow, her movements slow and deliberate. But beware, for those who see her are doomed to join her in her eternal dance. The Black Forest is her domain, and she does not take kindly to intruders. So if you ever find yourself near Kanasuma and you hear the faint sound of music on the wind, turn back and never look back. For if you don't, you may find yourself dancing with the Serbian Dancing Lady, forever lost in the shadows of the Black Forest. The Haunted Hotel of Vanjaka Banja. Vanjaka Banja, a picturesque spa town known for its healing mineral waters and serene atmosphere, is a place where people come to relax and rejuvenate. But in the 1980s, a new hotel was built on the outskirts of town, and with it came a series of strange and terrifying events that would forever be linked to the Serbian Dancing Lady. The hotel, known as Hotel Vila Rusa, was an elegant building, its architecture a blend of modern and traditional styles. It quickly became a popular destination for tourists seeking a peaceful retreat. But soon after it opened, guests began to report strange occurrences, unexplained noises in the night, objects moving on their own, and the faint sound of music coming from empty rooms. The hotel staff dismissed these reports as the product of overactive imaginations, but as the incidents grew more frequent, it became clear that something was very wrong. Guests would wake in the middle of the night to find their beds shaking, their rooms freezing cold despite the summer heat. Some reported seeing a woman in a white dress dancing in the hallways, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. One particularly disturbing incident occurred in the summer of 1985. A newlywed couple had checked into the hotel for their honeymoon, excited to spend their first week as husband and wife in the peaceful surroundings of Vanjaka Banja. But on their second night, they were awakened by the sound of music, soft, haunting, and coming from just outside their room. The husband, thinking it was a late-night celebration, opened the door to investigate. But what he saw froze him in place. There, in the dimly lit hallway, was the Serbian Dancing Lady. She moved slowly, her feet barely touching the ground as she danced to the eerie melody that filled the air. Her face was obscured by a veil, but her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, locked onto his, filling him with a deep, primal fear. The husband tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, unable to move as the woman danced closer and closer. His wife, hearing his labored breathing, came to the door and saw the same terrifying sight. She grabbed her husband, pulling him back into the room and slamming the door shut. The music stopped abruptly, leaving them in an oppressive silence. The couple fled the hotel the next morning, their faces pale and their hands trembling. They refused to speak of what had happened, but the fear in their eyes told the staff all they needed to know. The Serbian Dancing Lady had come to Hotel Vila Rusa, and her presence was not to be ignored. As word of the haunting spread, the hotel began to lose business. Guests cancelled their reservations, and those who did stay often left in the middle of the night, too frightened to remain. The owner, desperate to save his business, brought in priests, exorcists, and paranormal investigators, but nothing seemed to work. The Serbian Dancing Lady continued to haunt the hotel, her presence a constant reminder of the dark forces that had taken hold. In 1990, the hotel was closed, its doors locked and its windows boarded up. It remains abandoned to this day, a decaying shell of its former glory. The locals avoid it, speaking of it only in whispers, and those who venture too close often report feeling a deep sense of unease, as if they are being watched by unseen eyes. Some say that on certain nights, when the wind blows just right, you can still hear the faint sound of music coming from the old hotel. And if you're brave, or foolish, enough to listen, you might just catch a glimpse of her, the Serbian Dancing Lady, dancing in the shadows, her eyes locked onto yours, drawing you into her eternal nightmare. The final encounter. The legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady is one that has endured for centuries, her story passed down from generation to generation, her presence felt in every corner of Serbia. But for those who have encountered her, the legend is all too real, a terrifying reminder that some forces are beyond human understanding. In 2023, a team of filmmakers set out to create a documentary about the Serbian Dancing Lady, hoping to capture the truth behind the legend. They traveled across Serbia, visiting the sites where she had been seen, interviewing locals, and delving into the darkest corners of the country's history. Their journey took them to the Black Forest, the abandoned village of Zmajevo, and the decaying remains of Hotel Vila Ruza. Everywhere they went, they found signs of her presence, strange sounds, cold spots, and the faint, haunting melody that seemed to follow them wherever they went. But it was in Belgrade, the city where the legend had first taken hold, that they would have their final, most terrifying encounter. The filmmakers had arranged to interview an old woman who claimed to have seen the Serbian Dancing Lady as a child. The woman, known only as Baba Malina, lived in a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city, her walls covered in religious icons and her shelves lined with candles. As they set up their equipment, Baba Malina told them the story of the Serbian Dancing Lady, of how she had once been a beautiful woman, cursed by a vengeful nobleman and doomed to wander the earth, searching for a soul to take her place. The filmmakers listened intently, their cameras rolling as the old woman spoke. But as the interview progressed, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, the air grew cold, and the cameras began to malfunction. The filmmakers, unnerved but determined, pressed on, asking Baba Malina about her own encounter with the Serbian Dancing Lady. The old woman hesitated, her eyes distant as if she was seeing something far away. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she told them that the Serbian Dancing Lady was not a ghost, but something far worse. A demon. A cursed soul bound to the earth by dark forces beyond human understanding. As she spoke, the room grew colder and the faint sound of music began to fill the air. The filmmakers exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing as the melody grew louder, more insistent. And then, without warning, Baba Malina stopped speaking, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at something behind the camera. The filmmakers turned to see what had frightened her, and there she was, the Serbian Dancing Lady. She stood in the corner of the room, her white dress glowing in the dim light, her eyes locked onto theirs. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as she began to dance to the haunting melody that filled the room. The filmmakers, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as she drew closer, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. The lights flickered once more, and the cameras cut out, plunging the room into darkness. When the lights came back on, the Serbian Dancing Lady was gone, but the damage had been done. The filmmakers fled the apartment, leaving their equipment behind, too terrified to look back. In the days that followed, they tried to piece together what had happened, but the footage they had captured was corrupted, the images distorted beyond recognition. Baba Malina refused to speak to them, her once vibrant personality replaced by a deep, unshakable fear. The documentary was never completed, and the filmmakers went their separate ways, haunted by the memory of that final encounter. The legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady continues to grow, her presence felt in every corner of Serbia. Her story is one of tragedy, of a soul trapped between worlds, forever cursed to dance in the shadows of a land that has seen too much death and suffering. But it is also a story of warning, a reminder that some forces are beyond our control, and that the darkness is always closer than we think. So if you ever find yourself alone on a dark, moonless night, and you hear the faint sound of music on the wind, take heed, turn back, and never look back. For if you do, you may find yourself dancing with the Serbian Dancing Lady trapped in her eternal nightmare. The Accursed Mask, the hidden artifact of the Serbian Dancing Lady. In the heart of Serbia, hidden deep within the archives of an old, forgotten library in Novi Sad, lies an artifact that few dare to speak of, the Mask of Vasilisa. This mask, said to have belonged to the Serbian Dancing Lady herself, is believed to hold the key to understanding the curse that has haunted Serbia for centuries. But those who have sought it out have rarely returned, and those who have are never the same. The story of the mask is as old as the legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady. It is said that before Vasilisa was cursed, she was gifted a mask by a mysterious traveler who passed through her village. The mask was exquisitely crafted, made of the finest materials, and adorned with jewels that sparkled in the light. But it was also a mask of power, imbued with dark magic that connected Vasilisa to the spiritual realm. At first, the mask enhanced her beauty and her dancing, making her the envy of all who saw her. But as time passed, Vasilisa began to notice strange things. Whenever she wore the mask, she would see shadows that weren't there, hear whispers in a language she didn't understand, and feel a cold presence that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The mask began to consume her, feeding on her vanity and drawing her deeper into the darkness. When the nobleman cursed Vasilisa, it is said that the mask became the focal point of the curse, binding her spirit to the mortal world and transforming her into the Serbian Dancing Lady. The mask, now a cursed object, was lost to history, its whereabouts unknown for centuries. But in the late 19th century, a group of scholars from Belgrade University came across an old manuscript in the library of Novi Sad that spoke of the mask and its connection to the Serbian Dancing Lady. Intrigued, they set out to find the mask, believing that it might hold the key to breaking the curse. Their search led them to the ruins of a medieval castle in the hills of southern Serbia, a place long abandoned and shunned by the locals. The castle, once a grand fortress, was now little more than a crumbling ruin, its halls filled with dust and the echoes of the past. But deep within the castle's dungeons, hidden behind a wall of stone, they found the mask. It was just as the manuscript had described, beautiful yet terrifying, its surface smooth and cold to the touch, the jewels dull and lifeless. The scholars, excited by their discovery, brought the mask back to Belgrade, intending to study it further. But they quickly realized that they had made a terrible mistake. From the moment they brought the mask back to the city, strange things began to happen. The scholars were plagued by nightmares, each one more vivid and horrifying than the last. They'd heard the faint sound of music in the night, and the shadows in their homes seemed to move of their own accord. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. The first to go was Professor Mladenovic, the leader of the expedition. He was found in his study, his body twisted and contorted, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The mask lay beside him, its surface now warm to the touch, the jewels glowing faintly in the dim light. The other scholars, terrified, tried to destroy the mask, but no matter what they did, it remained intact, its power seemingly growing stronger with each passing day. In desperation, they turned to the church, seeking the help of an exorcist to rid them of the cursed object. The exorcist, a man of great faith and experience, agreed to help, but even he was unable to break the curse. He warned the scholars that the mask was bound to the Serbian Dancing Lady, and that as long as her spirit remained trapped in the mortal world, the mask would continue to exert its influence. In the end, the scholars decided to hide the mask away, burying it deep within the archives of the library in Novi Sad, where they hoped it would be forgotten. But the mask was not forgotten. It was merely waiting, biding its time until someone foolish enough to seek it out would once again unleash its power. The curse continues. In the decades that followed, the library became known as a place of strange occurrences. Librarians and visitors alike reported seeing shadows moving in the corners of their vision, hearing the faint sound of music, and feeling a cold presence in the air. Some even claimed to have seen the Serbian Dancing Lady herself, her figure glimpsed in the darkened hallways late at night. One particularly chilling account comes from Milos, a young librarian who worked at the library in the early 2000s. Milos was a skeptic, dismissing the stories as mere superstition until one fateful night when he was tasked with closing the library. As he walked through the darkened halls, checking to make sure all the lights were off and the doors were locked, he heard it, the faint sound of music, coming from somewhere deep within the archives. Curious, Milos followed the sound, descending into the lower levels of the library where the oldest and most valuable books were kept. The music grew louder as he approached the archives, its haunting melody filling the air and sending chills down his spine. And then, in the flickering light of his lantern, he saw her. The Serbian Dancing Lady stood in the center of the room, her white dress glowing in the dim light, her movements slow and deliberate as she danced to the music that seemed to come from nowhere. Her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, locked onto Milos, and he felt a cold hand grip his heart. Paralyzed with fear, Milos watched as the lady danced closer, her movements growing more frantic, more erratic. The air around him grew colder, the shadows lengthening as they seemed to reach out towards him. And then, just as she was about to reach him, she stopped. The music ceased and the lady vanished, leaving Milos alone in the darkened archives, his heart pounding in his chest. The mask lay on the floor where she had stood, its surface cold and lifeless, the jewels once again dull and dark. Milos fled the library that night, never to return, his mind shattered by what he had seen. The mask remains hidden in the library to this day, its location known only to a few. But those who know of its existence also know that it is only a matter of time before the curse resurfaces and the Serbian dancing lady returns to claim another victim. The mysterious disappearances of Petrovaradin, a historic town located on the banks of the Danube River, is known for its grand fortress and rich history. But in recent years, it has also become known for something far more sinister, the unexplained disappearances of those who venture too close to the fortress at night. The fortress, with its labyrinth of tunnels and hidden passages, is a popular tourist destination during the day. But as night falls, the atmosphere changes, the once lively streets growing eerily silent, the shadows deepening as the sun sets behind the hills. It is in these shadows that the Serbian dancing lady is said to roam, her presence felt by those who dare to wander too close. The first disappearance occurred in 2018 when a local guide named Jovan was leading a group of tourists on a night tour of the fortress. The group, intrigued by the stories of the Serbian dancing lady, insisted on exploring the tunnels, despite Jovan's warnings. As they descended into the dark, narrow passageways, the air grew colder, and the once confident tourists began to feel a growing sense of unease. Jovan, who had led countless tours through the fortress, tried to reassure them, but even he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they reached the deepest part of the tunnels, the lights began to flicker, and the faint sound of music echoed through the passageways. The tourists, now frightened, urged Jovan to take them back to the surface. But as they turned to leave, they realized that one of their group was missing. A young woman named Elena, who had been at the back of the group. Panic set in as they called out her name, their voices echoing off the stone walls, but there was no answer. The omen of Veliki Kas. High in the Serbian mountains, in a place where few dare to venture, lies Veliki Kas, a rugged and desolate peak that has long been associated with death and misfortune. The mountain is known for its treacherous terrain, its steep cliffs, and its unpredictable weather, but it is also known for something far more terrifying, the Serbian dancing lady. The legend of Veliki Kas dates back to the 14th century when a noble family attempted to build a fortress on its slopes. But the project was plagued with disasters, workers mysteriously disappeared, tools went missing, and the walls of the fortress would crumble as soon as they were built. The locals, fearful of angering the spirits that they believed inhabited the mountain, refused to work on the project, and it was eventually abandoned. Since then, Veliki Kas has been a place of death, its slopes littered with the remains of those who dared to climb its heights. The Serbian dancing lady is said to appear to those who ventured too close to the peak, her presence an omen of impending doom. One of the most famous encounters with the Serbian dancing lady on Veliki Kas occurred in 1932 when a group of mountaineers attempted to reach the summit. The group, led by a seasoned climber named Dragan, was well prepared for the journey, their packs filled with supplies, and their spirits high as they began their ascent. But as they climbed higher, the weather began to change. The once clear skies darkened, and a thick fog rolled in, obscuring their path. The air grew colder, and the wind howled through the rocks, carrying with it the faint sound of music. Dragan, sensing that something was wrong, urged the group to turn back, but they refused, determined to reach the summit. As they pressed on, the fog grew thicker, and the music grew louder, its haunting melody filling the air and sending chills down their spines. And then, as they reached a narrow ledge near the summit, they saw her. The Serbian dancing lady stood on the edge of the cliff, her white dress billowing in the wind, her feet moving in time with the music that seemed to come from nowhere. Her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, locked onto Dragan, and he felt a cold hand grip his heart. The group, paralyzed with fear, watched as the lady danced closer, her movements slow and deliberate. The ledge beneath their feet began to crumble, the rocks giving way as the mountain itself seemed to reject their presence. Dragan, realizing that they were in grave danger, shouted for the group to retreat, but it was too late. The ground beneath them gave way, and the group tumbled down the mountainside, their screams lost in the wind. Dragan miraculously survived the fall, but the others were not so lucky. Their bodies were found scattered among the rocks, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. Dragan, haunted by the memory of that day, never climbed again. He spoke of the Serbian Dancing Lady only once, warning others to stay away from Veliki Krš, lest they suffer the same fate. The mountain remains a place of death, its peak shrouded in fog, and its slopes littered with the bones of those who dared to challenge the Serbian Dancing Lady. The prophecy of the blood moon. As the years have passed, the legend of the Serbian Dancing Lady has continued to grow, her presence felt in every corner of Serbia. But there is one night when her power is said to be at its peak. The night of the blood moon. The blood moon, a rare lunar event in which the moon takes on a deep reddish hue, has long been associated with omens and prophecies. In Serbia, it is believed that the Serbian Dancing Lady is at her most powerful on this night, her curse spreading across the land, and her hunger for souls insatiable. The most recent blood moon occurred in 2025, and with it came a series of strange and terrifying events that left the people of Serbia in a state of fear. In the weeks leading up to the event, reports of sightings of the Serbian Dancing Lady began to increase, a figure seen in the streets of Belgrade, the forests of the countryside, and the ancient ruins that dot the landscape. As the night of the blood moon approached, the air grew thick with tension, the skies darkening as if in anticipation of something terrible. The people of Serbia, fearful of what was to come, stayed indoors, their doors and windows locked, and their prayers whispered in the dark. But despite their precautions, the Serbian Dancing Lady made her presence known. In the small village of Kopaonik, nestled in the mountains, the blood moon rose, casting an eerie red glow over the landscape. The villagers, gathered in their homes, watched in terror as the moon climbed higher in the sky, its light growing brighter and more intense. And then, as the moon reached its zenith, the village was plunged into darkness. The lights flickered out, the air grew cold, and the faint sound of music began to fill the air. The villagers, their hearts pounding, heard the sound growing louder, closer, until it was all around them. And then, in the center of the village, she appeared. The Serbian Dancing Lady, her white dress stained with blood, danced in the moonlight, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes locked onto the terrified villagers. The music grew louder, more insistent. As she danced closer, her presence a harbinger of death. One by one, the villagers began to fall, their bodies convulsing as they were overcome by the curse. The Serbian Dancing Lady moved among them, her dance growing faster and more erratic as she claimed their souls, her hunger insatiable. By the time the blood moon set, the village was silent, its streets empty, its houses dark. The Serbian Dancing Lady had vanished, leaving behind only the bodies of those she had claimed, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. The blood moon passed, and the people of Serbia emerged from their homes, their hearts heavy with grief and fear. The village of Kopaonik was abandoned, its name added to the growing list of places haunted by the Serbian Dancing Lady. The prophecy of the blood moon continues to loom over Serbia, a reminder that the Serbian Dancing Lady is always there, waiting in the shadows, her curse unbroken, her hunger unending. And as the next blood moon approaches, the people of Serbia prepare for the worst, knowing that the Serbian Dancing Lady will return, and that no one is safe from her eternal dance of death. The darkened woods of Fruška Gora. Fruška Gora, a mountain range in northern Serbia known for its serene beauty and ancient monasteries, has long been a place of pilgrimage and spiritual reflection. But even in this sacred land, the shadow of the Serbian Dancing Lady looms large. Hidden among the dense woods of Fruška Gora are tales of encounters so terrifying that they have driven even the most devout monks to the brink of madness. The legend begins with the monastery of Biosin, one of the oldest and most revered monasteries in the region. Nestled deep within the woods, the monastery has been a sanctuary for those seeking peace and solace for centuries. But one night in the early 1900s, that peace was shattered by an encounter that would forever change the history of the monastery. It was a cold autumn evening. and the monks had gathered in the chapel for their evening prayers. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, the soft glow of candlelight casting long shadows on the stone walls. As the monks chanted their prayers, a strange sound began to echo through the chapel, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The monks paused, their voices faltering as they listened to the sound. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, a melody that was both haunting and beautiful, filled with sorrow and longing. The abbot, a wise and elderly man named Father Milutin, stood and gestured for the monks to remain silent. He walked slowly to the entrance of the chapel, his heart pounding in his chest as the tapping grew louder. When he opened the door, he saw her. The Serbian Dancing Lady stood at the edge of the forest, her white dress glowing in the moonlight, her feet moving in time with the music that filled the air. Her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, were fixed on Father Milutin, and he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The lady danced slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful, as if inviting him to join her. Father Milutin, his heart filled with dread, stepped back into the chapel and closed the door. He ordered the monks to resume their prayers, but the music continued to play, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. The monks, their faces pale with fear, tried to focus on their prayers, but the music was too powerful, too overwhelming. One by one, they began to falter, their voices growing weaker as the lady's dance drew closer. The candles flickered and then went out, plunging the chapel into darkness. Father Milutin, desperate to protect his brothers, took the holy relics from the altar and held them high, praying for deliverance from the evil that had come to their monastery. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the chapel seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out like dark tendrils to envelop the monks. And then, with a final, piercing scream, the Serbian Dancing Lady appeared in the center of the chapel. Her dance was no longer slow and graceful, it was wild and chaotic, her movements a blur of white as she spun and twirled in the darkness. The music reached a fever pitch, drowning out the prayers of the monks as they cowered in fear. The walls of the chapel shook, the very ground beneath their feet trembling as if the earth itself were reacting to the lady's presence. Father Milutin, his voice hoarse with prayer, stepped forward and placed the holy relics at the feet of the Serbian Dancing Lady. For a moment, the music stopped and the lady paused in her dance. She looked down at the relics, her expression unreadable, and then she slowly began to fade, her form dissolving into the shadows. The music stopped and the air grew still. The candles flickered back to life, casting a warm glow over the chapel. The monks, shaken but unharmed, fell to their knees in prayer, thanking God for their deliverance. But Father Milutin knew that the Serbian Dancing Lady had not been banished, only held at bay. In the years that followed, the monks of Biosin Monastery continued to experience strange occurrences. The sound of music would sometimes echo through the woods at night, and the lady's figure was occasionally seen dancing at the edge of the forest. The monks learned to live with her presence, knowing that she was always there, watching, waiting. But one night, many years later, a young monk named Brother Stefan decided to confront the Serbian Dancing Lady. He had heard the stories all his life, but he refused to believe that she was real. Determined to prove that the tales were nothing more than superstition, Brother Stefan ventured into the woods alone, armed only with his faith and a small crucifix. As he walked deeper into the forest, the air grew colder and the trees seemed to close in around him. The sound of music began to play, soft at first, but growing louder with each step he took. Brother Stefan felt a growing sense of unease, but he pressed on, determined to face whatever lay ahead. The cursed wedding of Užice. Užice, a town nestled in the mountains of western Serbia, is known for its rich history and vibrant culture. But it is also known for a wedding that ended in tragedy, a night when the Serbian Dancing Lady claimed the souls of an entire wedding party. The story begins with Milan and Jelena, a young couple from Užice who were deeply in love. Their wedding was to be a grand affair, a celebration of their love and the joining of their two families. The entire town was invited, and the festivities were to last for 3 days and 3 nights. The first 2 days of the wedding were filled with joy and laughter, the air ringing with the sounds of music and celebration. But on the 3rd night, as the full moon rose high in the sky, the atmosphere changed. A cold wind blew through the town, extinguishing the candles and sending chills down the spines of the guests. The music, once lively and joyful, became slow and haunting, the melody filled with a sense of foreboding. As the guests gathered in the town square for the final dance of the night, a strange figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. She was dressed in white, her face hidden by a veil, and her movements slow and deliberate as she made her way towards the center of the square. The guests, thinking her to be a latecomer to the wedding, made room for her to join the dance. But as she moved among them, a sense of unease began to spread. The air grew colder, and the music grew louder, more insistent, as if it were coming from the very ground beneath their feet. And then, as the figure reached the center of the square, she began to dance. The Serbian Dancing Lady moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, her feet barely touching the ground as she spun and twirled in the moonlight. The guests watched in stunned silence, unable to look away as her dance grew faster, more chaotic. Milan and Jelena, standing at the edge of the square, felt a growing sense of dread as they realized who the figure was. Milan tried to pull Jelena away, but it was too late. The ladies' dance had taken hold of the crowd, and one by one, the guests began to fall to the ground, their bodies writhing in agony as the curse took hold. The music grew louder, drowning out the screams of the dying as the Serbian Dancing Lady moved among them. Her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, locked onto Milan and Jelena, and they knew that there was no escape. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the music stopped and the lady vanished, leaving behind only the bodies of the wedding guests, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. Milan and Jelena were found lying together in the center of the square, their hands clasped in death, their love unable to protect them from the curse of the Serbian Dancing Lady. The town of Uzis was plunged into mourning, the joy of the wedding replaced by the sorrow of an entire community. The square where the wedding took place was abandoned, left to decay as a reminder of the tragedy that had occurred. And the story of the cursed wedding was passed down from generation to generation, a warning to all who would dare to celebrate under the light of the full moon.